The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft. The ink blurred at the edges where Susanna Walker's fingers had pressed and pressed again, as though she could memorize the words through her skin alone. She had read it every night for 3 weeks, sitting at the edge of the narrow bed in the boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, the year 1873, while the sounds of the saloon 2 streets over drifted up through the thin walls, and the candle burned lower and lower until she had to stop, not because she wanted to, but because there was no light left to read by. The letter was from her husband's former business partner, a man named Gerald Potts, and it said, in language that was polite but unmistakably final, that the Walker homestead debt had been called in by the bank in Dodge City, that the cattle had already been seized, and that there was nothing left to claim. Her husband Thomas had been dead 4 months. The fever had taken him fast, the way fevers do in that part of Kansas when the summer heat sits on the land like a wet blanket, and there is no shade and no relief and no mercy for the weak. She was 28 years old and she had nothing. She had a carpet bag with 2 dresses, a pair of boots that were wearing through at the left heel, a small tin photograph of Thomas, and approximately $4.60 to her name. She also had a 7-year-old daughter named Clara, who slept beside her in that narrow bed with her small fist pressed against her cheek and her dark hair spread out on the pillow like a question mark. There was one other thing Susanna Walker had, and that was a name written on a scrap of paper that Gerald Potts had pressed into her hand with something that looked almost like shame before he turned and walked away down the dusty street. The name was Harvey Underwood. Potts had told her, in the brief and uncomfortable conversation they'd had on the steps of the Dodge City Bank, that Harvey Underwood ran the largest cattle operation in the southern half of Comanche County, that he was known to be a fair man, and that he sometimes hired on additional help for the fall roundup season. He had not said whether Harvey Underwood would hire a widow with a child. He had not said much of anything else useful. He had just given her the name and walked away, and Susanna had stood on those bank steps with the paper in her hand, and the Kansas sun beating down on her head, and thought, well, what other choice is there? The ride out to the Underwood ranch took most of a day. She hired a wagon from the livery in Abilene for the last of her money, a weathered old man named Elias who barely spoke and smelled of tobacco and horse, and he drove her and Clara out along the flat ribbon of road that cut through the grassland with the sky enormous and blue above them, and the wind moving the tall grass in long, slow waves. Clara sat beside Susanna with her doll tucked under one arm and watched everything with those serious dark eyes of hers that had gotten more serious since her father died. She didn't ask questions any more the way she used to. That was the thing that hurt Susanna most, more than the debt and the empty house and the letter from the bank. The silence where Clara's questions used to be. The Underwood ranch appeared on the horizon the way things appear in open country, first as a dark smudge, then as angles and shapes, then slowly as something real. There was a main house built from limestone blocks with a wide porch running along the front, a barn that was larger than most churches Susanna had seen, a bunkhouse set back to the east, corrals and outbuildings and a well with a wooden cover, and all around it the grassland running to the horizon in every direction with cattle moving through it in slow drifting groups. It was not a pretty place in the way that the houses back east were pretty, but it had a kind of serious permanence to it that the temporary and desperate places Susanna had been inhabiting for the past 4 months entirely lacked. Elias brought the wagon to a stop about 30 yards from the front porch. He looked at the house and looked at Susanna and said nothing, which she had come to understand was his way of communicating most things. "You can go on back," she told him. "I'll manage from here." He looked at her again, this time with something that might have been concern, but he clicked his tongue at the horse and turned the wagon around, and she watched it go for a moment before she picked up her carpet bag and held out her hand to Clara, who took it without speaking, and they walked toward the house together across the hard-packed earth. She did not know what she was going to say. She had rehearsed several versions of an opening statement during the long flat drive, but they had all dissolved somewhere between thinking them and needing them. And now that she was actually walking toward that limestone house in the late afternoon light with her daughter's hand in hers, all she had was the truth, which was that she was a widow with $7 and no prospects and a little girl who needed a bed and regular meals, and she was willing to work for both. She had done this before, or something like it. She had stood on the edges of other people's charity before, after her own parents died when she was 15, and she had gone to live with her aunt in Missouri, who had taken her in with a tightness around the mouth that made it clear she considered generosity a burden she was bearing for the Lord's sake rather than her own. She knew what it felt like to prepare yourself for the moment when someone looked at you and decided you were more trouble than you were worth. She had spent most of her adult life trying not to need anything from anyone, and Thomas had been a relief partly because he was kind, and partly because with him she had not needed to stand on anyone else's doorstep and wait to be told whether she was welcome. She was still 10 feet from the door, still composing the words in her head, still telling herself to stand straight and look steady and not let the exhaustion show in her face when the door opened. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, the way he filled the doorframe, broad-shouldered and wearing a plain shirt the color of the sky just before dark, with dark hair that was sun-touched at the ends and eyes that were somewhere between brown and gold when the light hit them right. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor work and weather but had not been hardened by it the way some men's faces were. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that looked more like they came from squinting against the sun and from laughing than from cruelty, and he was looking at her with an expression of such calm and open attentiveness that it stopped her mid-step. "Mrs. Walker," he said, not a question. She stopped entirely. Clara pressed closer against her leg. "I'm sorry," Susanna said, because she couldn't think of anything else. "I haven't knocked yet." The corner of his mouth moved. "No, ma'am, you haven't. I was watching from the window. Gerald Potts sent me a letter 2 weeks ago saying you might come." He stepped back and held the door open wider. "Please come in, both of you. I've had Rosaria set extra places for supper." Susanna stood there in the late afternoon light and felt something shift in her chest, something she could not immediately name. She had been preparing for rejection with such focused determination that the alternative had simply not occurred to her as a real possibility. She had the door-opening speech and the please hear me out speech and the I will work hard speech all lined up and ready, and none of them were needed, and the absence of needing them left her standing there with her mouth slightly open and her heart doing something strange and complicated in her chest. "You were expecting us," she said. "I was hoping," Harvey Underwood said quietly, and stepped back further to let them in. The inside of the house was simple and clean and warmer than she expected. There was a main room with a stone fireplace and a long wooden table and chairs, a kitchen beyond it where a smell of something roasting drifted through the air, and a hallway leading to what she assumed were the sleeping rooms. The walls were bare limestone, except for one oil lamp hanging on an iron hook, and a small framed watercolor of a mountain range that looked like it had been painted by someone who loved mountains very much and missed them. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, more books than she would have expected in a ranch house, and a pair of reading glasses folded on top of them that struck her as somehow deeply personal, like she was seeing something she hadn't been meant to see. A woman appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was perhaps 50, Mexican, with gray-streaked black hair pinned back and an apron over a dark dress, and the particular expression of someone who runs a household and knows it. "This is Rosaria," Harvey said. "She has been with this ranch since before I bought it. She runs the kitchen and most everything else if she's honest." "I run everything," Rosaria said without heat, and then she looked at Clara and her entire face changed. "And who is this little one?" "Clara," Susanna said, and felt Clara's fingers tighten on hers. "Clara," Rosaria repeated, making the name sound like something good. "Are you hungry, Clara? I have made beef stew and there is cornbread that came out of the oven 20 minutes ago." Clara looked up at Susanna. Susanna felt her own throat tight. "Say thank you," Susanna managed. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Come," Rosaria said, and held out her hand. And after a moment that felt very long, Clara released Susanna's fingers and crossed the room and took Rosaria's hand instead, and they disappeared into the kitchen together. Susanna stood in the main room of Harvey Underwood's ranch house and felt the tears come up behind her eyes and fought them back with everything she had, because she had told herself she was not going to cry in front of this stranger no matter what happened, and she meant to keep that promise to herself. "Sit down," Harvey said, in a voice that was very quiet and not at all an order, more like an offering. "Please." She sat in one of the chairs at the table and he sat across from her and set his hat on the table between them and looked at her with that same steady, unguarded attention that had stopped her in the yard. "Gerald told me what happened," he said. "About Thomas, I'm sorry. I knew Thomas briefly back when he was running cattle north of Dodge. He seemed like a good man." "He was," Susanna said. She pressed her hands flat on the table to keep them steady. "He was a very good man." Harvey nodded. He looked like he was going to say something and then decided against it, and she was grateful for that, because there were only so many times you could hear "I'm sorry for your loss" before the words stopped meaning anything at all. "Here is what I can offer," he said instead, and the directness of it was a relief. "I have a spare room at the back of the house. It is small, but it is clean and it has 2 beds. I have work enough for someone willing to work. Rosaria could use help in the house, and I have been meaning to get the account books in order. Gerald mentioned that you have some education." "I was a school teacher," Susanna said, "before I married Thomas, in Missouri. I can read and write and do figures, and I am a fair hand with a needle and thread. I can cook, though Rosaria is clearly better at it than I am already." She stopped and took a breath. "I will not be a burden. I don't know how long it would take me to get back on my feet, but I intend to do it and I will earn whatever I take." Harvey looked at her for a moment with those amber-brown eyes and said, "I don't doubt that." Then he added, "There is one thing I should say plainly." "Please do." "I am a single man, and you are a woman, and there will be talk," he said. "There already was, probably, when Elias drove you out here. People talk in this part of Kansas, and I don't care about it personally, but I want you to know it before you decide anything." Susanna met his eyes. "Mr. Underwood, I am sleeping in a boarding house room that I cannot pay for next week. My daughter has had one proper hot meal in the last 3 days, and my only other option is to go back to my aunt in Missouri, who has made clear on multiple occasions that she considers me a burden and an imposition. I am not afraid of talk." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the bones of one. "Then we have a deal," he said, and offered his hand across the table. She shook it. His hand was large and warm and work-roughened, and she felt the grip of it all the way up her arm. That first evening set a pattern, or at least began one. They ate supper at the long table, the 4 of them, Harvey at the head and Susanna across from him and Clara between them, with Rosaria coming and going from the kitchen with the easy authority of a woman in her own domain. The food was extraordinary. The stew was thick and fragrant with cumin and dried pepper, and the cornbread was golden and steaming, and Clara ate 2 full bowls and half a piece of cornbread before her head started drooping toward the table. Susanna watched her daughter eat with a warmth in her chest that was so intense it was almost painful. Harvey watched Clara with an expression that was careful and a little wondering, as though he wasn't quite sure what to do with a small person at his table, and found the experience more interesting than he had expected. "She's very quiet," he said to Susanna, low enough that Clara, who had fallen into a sort of half-doze over her cornbread, wouldn't hear. "She used to talk constantly," Susanna said, equally low. "Since Thomas died she's been quiet. The doctor said it sometimes happens with children, that she'll find her voice again when she feels safe." Harvey looked at Clara for another moment and then looked at Susanna, and there was something in his expression then that was so genuine and so unguarded that it made her look away at her own hands. "She will feel safe here," he said, and said it the way people say things when they mean them and are not performing the meaning for anyone's benefit. Susanna went to bed that night in the small, clean room at the back of the house with Clara tucked in beside her, and lay awake for a long time listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into the dark. Cattle somewhere distant, a horse shifting in the barn, the wind in the grass. She thought about Harvey Underwood standing in his doorway before she knocked and felt a warmth move through her that she told herself firmly was only gratitude, only relief, nothing more complicated than that. She told herself that for several weeks before she stopped believing it. The work helped. Work always helped Susanna Walker, because when her hands and mind were occupied, there was no room for the lurking shadow that crept up on her sometimes, the grief and the fear, the particular weight of being entirely alone in the world in a way that widowhood imposes and that nothing can quite prepare you for. She learned the rhythms of the Underwood ranch quickly, and the ranch had many rhythms, all of them demanding and satisfying in equal measure. Morning started before dawn when Rosaria banged a pot in the kitchen, and the ranch hands stirred in the bunkhouse, and the horses began their patient noise. Susanna got up with Clara, helped the little girl dress and wash her face, and then they both appeared in the kitchen where Rosaria had already been moving for an hour, and the stove was radiating heat, and there was coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Susanna took over the bread making and the biscuits after the first week because Rosaria's hands were beginning to hurt her in the mornings, though Rosaria would not say so directly and only yielded the rolling pin with a look that suggested she was doing Susanna a favor rather than the reverse. The account books were a disaster. Harvey brought them out on the third day and set them on the table with the expression of a man presenting a problem he had been avoiding, and Susanna opened them and spent the next 2 hours with her head down and her pencil moving, while Harvey sat across from her and answered her questions about what various entries meant, and occasionally got up to look out the window in a way that suggested he found the whole exercise uncomfortable. "You have a good operation," she told him finally. "But your records are a mess. You have expenses coming out of 3 different places with no common ledger, and 2 of your suppliers have been overcharging you." She turned the book around and showed him the columns she'd drawn. "If you consolidate here and renegotiate with the feed merchant in Abilene, you'd save approximately $80 over the next 6 months. He looked at the columns for a long moment, then he looked at her. "How long would it take you to get all of it in order?" he asked. 2 weeks, probably, maybe 3. "Then do it," he said. "Name your rate." She named a rate that was lower than what the work deserved, and he crossed it out and wrote a higher one in the margin without looking up from the book. And she felt a flush of warmth that she again told herself was only professional satisfaction. Clara began to find her footing in the 3rd week. It was Rosaria who managed it first, because Rosaria had a genius for small creatures that Susanna suspected ran deeper than cooking and household management. She taught Clara to make tortillas, pressing the little girl's hands flat on the dough, and talking to her in a mixture of English and Spanish that Clara listened to with that serious face, and then, gradually, began to respond to with small sounds and then words. One morning Susanna came into the kitchen to find Clara standing on a stool at the counter beside Rosaria, pressing dough with small determined hands, and singing something under her breath, a thin little tune without real words, but singing, actually singing, and Susanna had to turn around and walk back out into the hallway for a moment and press her hand over her mouth. Harvey found her there. He came around the corner from the direction of the front room with a coffee cup in his hand and stopped when he saw her, and she straightened immediately and said, "I beg your pardon," and he said, "Clara." And she nodded, and he looked at the kitchen doorway from where the singing was still faintly audible, and something passed across his face that she had no word for. "She sang this morning," Susanna said, steadying her voice. "She hasn't made any music since Thomas died." Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good," in a voice that wasn't quite steady either, and walked past her toward the kitchen door, where he leaned against the frame and looked in at Clara and Rosaria without saying anything. Just watched them with that expression she was beginning to recognize as his own particular form of tenderness, quiet and contained and entirely real. The ranch hands were 6 in number, with a rotating 7th during heavy seasons, and they ranged from a young Mexican hand named Felipe, who was perhaps 19 and full of nervous energy, to an older man named Dutch, whose real name was something Dutch and unpronounceable, who had been working cattle since before the war, and had the weathered calm of a man who had seen most things and been surprised by very little. There was also a red-haired young man named Patrick who went red in the face whenever he spoke to Susanna, which she found both endearing and inconvenient, and a quiet Comanche man named Follows Water, who handled the horses with a skill that bordered on the mystical, and who had been with Harvey since before the others. The situation of Follows Water was one that reminded Susanna, in the brief and uncomfortable way that comfortable situations sometimes allow you to notice uncomfortable truths, of the larger injustices that sat beneath the surface of daily life in Kansas in 1873. The treaties that had pushed the Comanche further and further south, the systematic erasure of the way of life that Follows Water and people like him had known, the particular loneliness of being between worlds and fully belonging to neither. She did not say this to anyone, but she thought it, and she noticed that Harvey paid Follows Water the same wage as the others, and consulted his opinion on horse matters with a seriousness that was genuine rather than performed, and that the two men had a conversation sometimes that was conducted in short silences and half-finished sentences that suggested they understood each other in ways that did not require words. She was 3 weeks into her time at the ranch when she first went out to look at the cattle operation properly. Harvey had mentioned at breakfast that he was riding out to check the north herd, and she had said, without thinking much about it, that she would like to come, and he had looked at her for a moment and said, "Can you ride?" "My father had horses," she told him. "I haven't ridden in years, but I don't think it leaves you entirely." "It doesn't," he agreed. Rosaria gave Susanna a look that had layers to it when Susanna asked her to watch Clara for the morning, and Susanna met the look with a steady gaze and something that was not quite a denial of anything and not quite an acknowledgement either. She rode a steady gray mare named Belle who had been selected by Harvey with a casualness that she later came to understand was actually careful consideration, and they rode out through the morning, which was cool and brilliant with the particular October light of Kansas, the grass gone golden and the sky an impossible depth of blue. Harvey rode a chestnut gelding, and they went side by side along the track that led north through the pastures, and for the first half-mile neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "How long have you had this land?" she asked eventually. 8 years, he said. "I came out from Ohio in '65, after the war." He said it the way men said after the war in those years, with a certain finality that indicated the period before it was not being discussed. "Were you in the fighting?" "Yes." She let that sit where he had put it and didn't press it. "Why Kansas?" He looked at the horizon for a moment. "Because it was empty," he said finally. "I wanted empty. I wanted a place where you could look as far as your eyes would carry and there was no evidence of what men are capable of doing to each other." A pause. "It worked mostly." She thought about that. "I understand wanting a place to start fresh." He glanced at her. "Is that what you're doing?" "I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing," she said honestly. "Right now I'm surviving. Start fresh might come after that." Something in his expression shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. "Fair enough," he said. They found the north herd grazing in a wide swale between 2 low rises, a few hundred head of good Texas longhorns with some graded Herefords mixed in, and Harvey rode the perimeter with the easy authority of a man who knows every animal in his care, noting things in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket with a pencil stub tucked behind his ear. She watched him work, and thought about how different the reality of this man was from the idea she had formed from Potts's brief description. She had expected efficiency. She had not expected the particular attentiveness, the way he noticed small things, a limping calf here, a section of fence that wanted attention there, the way he spoke to Dutch and Felipe when they rode out to meet him, equal and direct and listening for their answers. On the ride back, she found herself telling him about Thomas, which surprised her because she had not intended to and had not yet told anyone much about it. She told him about the homestead near Dodge City that Thomas had been so proud of, the little house they had built together with planks hauled out from town, the first winter that had nearly broken them and the second winter that hadn't, the way the land had finally started to feel like theirs just before the drought came and stayed and stayed and stayed until the debt mounted, and the cattle died and Thomas got sick, and everything came apart at once. She told it straightforwardly, without self-pity, the way you tell a story when you have had enough time to look at it from outside yourself, though she was not entirely outside it yet. Harvey listened without interrupting, which was not as common a quality as one might hope for. "He sounds like a man who worked hard at something difficult," Harvey said when she had finished. "He did," she said. "He deserved better than what he got." "Most people do," Harvey said quietly. She looked at him then and found him looking at her, and for a moment the only sound was the horse's hooves in the grass and the wind moving through it, and the look between them was long enough to mean something. And then he looked away toward the south and the ranch on the horizon, and she looked away too, and they rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from the silence that had come before it. October became November, and the temperature dropped, and the landscape changed from gold to brown, and the sky changed from blue to a deeper gray that carried cold in it. The rhythm of the ranch adjusted, as it always did, and Susanna adjusted with it, and she stopped thinking of herself as a guest and started thinking of herself as someone who belonged there, which was a transition she had not expected to happen so quickly, but which felt entirely natural when it did. Clara had fully recovered her voice by mid-November, and having recovered it showed no interest in giving it back. She talked at breakfast and through most of the evening meal, and at a steady rate during all the hours in between, and Rosaria received this without complaint and seemed, in fact, to encourage it, drawing Clara out on topics ranging from the names of the horses to the proper way to season beans to what Clara planned to do when she grew up, which changed daily and included, at various points, ranch owner, horse trainer, school teacher, baker of pies, and wife of a cowboy. This last option offered one evening at supper with complete seriousness while looking at Felipe, who went red as a beet. Harvey laughed at that. It was the first time Susanna had heard him laugh fully, not the small controlled movement at the corners of his mouth, but an actual laugh, warm and unguarded and entirely surprised. And it changed his face in a way that did something to her she was no longer pretending was simple. She sat across from him at the table with that laugh still echoing in the room and thought, with a clarity that was both welcome and terrifying, that she was falling in love with Harvey Underwood. She thought it the way you think something you have been carefully not thinking for weeks, all at once and completely, and once it was thought it was impossible to unthink it, sitting there in the warm light of the main room with Clara still talking and Rosaria laughing in the kitchen and Harvey's eyes still bright with the laughter. She gave herself a thorough and stern internal talking, to later that night. She was a widow of 4 months. She was living in this man's house on his charity, or near enough to it that the difference was largely semantic. She had a daughter who needed stability above all things and a history of loss that made her, she was quite certain, a poor candidate for any kind of additional emotional risk. Harvey Underwood was a good man, but he had given her no indication of any feeling beyond straightforward kindness, and kindness was not love and should not be confused with it. She was very clear-headed and reasonable about the whole thing, and none of it helped at all. Harvey was having his own internal conversation, though it ran differently. His was less rational and more physical, lived in the awareness of her presence in a room before he saw her, in the particular quality of her attention when she was listening, in the way she moved with a kind of contained efficiency that never quite contained the grace beneath it. He was a man who had lived alone long enough to have made a kind of peace with it, who had decided somewhere in the years after the war that the simplicity of solitude was preferable to the complications of connection. He had been 24 when he came to Kansas and 32 now, and the peace he had made was genuine, or had been genuine. And then Susanna Walker had come walking across his yard in the late afternoon light with her carpet bag, and her daughter's hand in hers and her chin lifted with a dignity that broke something open in his chest. He had not been prepared for her. That was the truest way to put it. Gerald Potts had sent a letter and he had read it and thought, yes, I can help with that. The way he thought about most practical problems, with a direct and practical intention. He had not read the letter and thought, this woman is going to be the best and worst thing that has happened to you in years, Harvey. He had not been warned. There had been no warning. He told Dutch about it one morning in the barn while they were seeing to the horses because Dutch was Dutch, the kind of man who had accumulated so much experience of the world that he was essentially unsurprisable, and Harvey needed to say it out loud to someone. The widow, Dutch said, not a question. Yes, Harvey said. Been waiting for you to notice, Dutch said, running a brush along the chestnut's neck with the slow thoroughness of habit. Harvey looked at him. How long has it been obvious? Since the second week, Dutch said, when you started finding reasons to be in the house at midday. Harvey was quiet for a moment. I don't know what to do about it. You could try talking to her, Dutch said, with the magnificent simplicity of a man who has seen that most human problems could be solved by people simply speaking plainly to one another. It's not that simple, Harvey said. It's exactly that simple, Dutch said. Everything after that is complicated. The talking is simple. Harvey thought about that for several days without doing anything about it, because knowing something is simple and being able to do it are different things. And he was a man who had learned to be careful with people in the years after the war, and careful men, sometimes, find it difficult to be the first to speak. What changed things was a Saturday in December. The weather had turned fierce, and a norther had come in fast the way they do on the Kansas plains, sudden and white and cold, and everyone was confined to the house and the barn and the bunkhouse, and the main house was warmer than it had been, with both fires going and Rosaria cooking something that smelled of cinnamon and warm spice. Clara was in the kitchen with Rosaria, and the sound of them together came through the wall in comfortable waves. Harvey was at the table with the account books, now beautifully organized in Susanna's clear hand, and Susanna was in the armchair by the fire reading one of his books, her feet tucked up under her and her hair loose around her shoulders, because she had not pinned it yet, and the informality of it was the sort of thing he was trying not to look at and failing. She looked up from the book and found him not looking at the account book and said, with that directness that he had come to love about her, "What are you thinking about?" He put down his pencil. He thought about Dutch. He said, "You." The silence was very quiet. "What about me?" she said. "About whether you're happy here," he said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and he knew it even as he said it. She studied him for a moment. Outside, the wind hit the house in a gust and the fire flickered. "I'm more than happy here," she said. "I'm grateful. Every day I'm grateful for what you've done for us." "I don't want your gratitude," he said, and said it more sharply than he intended, and then said more carefully, "That came out wrong. I mean, I'm glad to have helped and I don't want you to feel obligated by it. That's not what I'm asking." She uncurled from the chair and set the book down and sat straight, watching him. "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. The wind outside, the fire, the distant sound of Clara and Rosaria. "I'm asking if you're planning on staying," he said finally. "Beyond the season. Beyond when it gets easier and you have money saved and you could go somewhere else." The question hung in the air between them, transparent with its real meaning. Susanna looked at him and thought about all the careful things she had told herself about gratitude versus love and stability versus risk, and what it meant to be a widow, and what it meant to want something again when you thought you had given up wanting things. She thought about Thomas, who was real and dead and deeply grieved, and who had also, she was entirely certain, not been the kind of man who would want her to grieve forever at the expense of everything else. "I would like to stay," she said. "If you want us to. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I want to be here." The distinction between those two things was exactly right, and he heard it exactly right. He got up from the table. He crossed the room toward her and stopped a few feet from the chair, and he was very still, the kind of stillness that is not distance but the opposite of it, the focused attention of a person who is not going anywhere. "Susanna," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "Harvey," she said, "I think I have been falling in love with you since you walked across my yard," he said. He said it plain, the way Dutch had advised, and the simplicity of it was the only appropriate way to say a thing that big. She felt the warmth of it move through her like something physical. She stood up from the chair so that they were not unequally positioned, and she was close enough to see the careful honesty in his face and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who was afraid but of a man who was waiting. "I think I have been falling in love with you for about the same length of time," she said, "and I have been very sensible about it, which has not helped at all." He laughed softly and reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a touch that was impossibly gentle for such a large, careful hand, and she leaned into it slightly without deciding to. "I should ask about Thomas," he said, "whether it's too soon." "Thomas was a good man and I loved him," she said. "He has been gone 4 months and there are days when I still reach for him and he's not there and that grief is real. But I think the heart has more room than we generally give it credit for, and he would have been glad for me to be here." She paused. "Is that honest enough?" "More than enough," he said quietly. He kissed her then, and it was not a tentative thing, though it was very gentle, because it was the kind of kiss that comes after something has been decided rather than while something is still being figured out. And she kissed him back with the same quality of decision in it. And outside the wind howled across the Kansas plains and the fire crackled. And in the kitchen Clara was laughing about something Rosaria had said. And the whole world felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a place where good things happened. Christmas came to the Underwood ranch with more ceremony than it had in at least the 8 years Harvey had been there, because Clara took Christmas personally and had opinions about it. There was a tree, brought in by Felipe and Patrick with considerable difficulty and some argument, a scrubby cedar from the creek bottom that Clara declared magnificent and decorated with Rosaria's help, using paper cutouts and dried berries and strips of red cloth. There were cookies, an enormous quantity of cookies, baked over 2 days with Clara standing on her stool and Rosaria supervising, and Susanna doing cleanup, and occasionally being allowed to frost something. Harvey contributed by staying out of the kitchen when requested and by riding into Abilene the week before, and returning with a wrapped parcel that he put under the cedar tree and wouldn't explain, even when Clara asked 6 times in a row at dinner. The parcel contained a small leather-bound journal with a red cover for Susanna and a china-faced doll with yellow hair and a blue dress for Clara, who screamed with delight and hugged it. And then, in a moment that made Susanna have to look very carefully at the ceiling, crossed the room and hugged Harvey around the knees, which was the highest she could reach, and said into his shirt, "Thank you, Mr. Underwood." Harvey looked down at her with an expression that Susanna stored somewhere deep and kept. "You're very welcome, Clara," he said, a little rough. The hands were given time off and rode into Abilene, most of them, though Dutch and Follows Water stayed close to the ranch, and Rosaria's nephew came from Dodge City with his wife and 2 small boys who ran around the yard, and got into everything with the cheerful purposefulness of small boys everywhere. The day had a fullness to it that Susanna had not felt in so long she had forgotten what it felt like. The particular warmth of being exactly where you were supposed to be, with the people you were supposed to be with. After supper Harvey and Susanna sat on the porch in coats, close enough that their shoulders touched, and watch the stars, which are extraordinary in Kansas in winter, enormous and thick and so present it feels as though the sky has come down to be nearer to you. "What are you thinking about?" he asked her, returning the question she had asked him 2 weeks ago. "That I didn't know it could feel like this again," she said simply. He took her hand. They stayed there until the cold got too serious to ignore and then went inside. And the fire was still going, and Clara had fallen asleep on the rug with her new doll clutched to her chest. And Harvey picked her up with a care that was so natural and so thorough that Susanna had to stop in the doorway and watch it. The big, careful man with the sleeping child in his arms, carrying her down the hallway to bed. January in Kansas was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, relentless and gray, with cold that had a personal quality to it, as though it was making a specific point about human insignificance. The cattle had to be watched and fed and checked, which meant the hands were out in it daily, and Harvey was out in it with them because he was that kind of rancher, the kind who didn't send men to do things he wasn't willing to do himself, which Follows Water had told Susanna once, with a brevity that made it more meaningful, was why the men stayed. There was a difficult week in February when a stretch of fence on the North Range gave way in a storm, and about 40 head got through onto a neighbor's land. A man named Cartwright who was not unfriendly, but was meticulous about boundaries and compensation. Harvey rode out to deal with it personally, and came back 2 days later cold and tired, and with Cartwright's handshake on a deal that cost him some money but preserved the neighbor relationship. And Susanna had a meal ready and the fire high, and said nothing about the 2 days of low-grade anxiety she had experienced. Though Harvey seemed to know about it anyway because he sat down at the table and looked at her across it with an expression of quiet gratitude that was very much like the expression she felt on her own face. "I wasn't worried," she said. "Of course not," he agreed, and they both let it sit there. He asked her to marry him in March, which came in like the proverbial lion with 3 days of hard rain, and then turned with that mercurial prairie magic into something mild and green-scented and full of birds. He asked her on an evening when the light was gold and long, and the land had that soft quality it gets after rain, and Clara was asleep and Rosaria had retired, and they were walking the fence line nearest the house because they did that sometimes, walking in the evening just to be outside and moving and together. He stopped and turned to her and said, "I would like very much for you to be my wife, Susanna. You and Clara both, if you'll have me." She stopped too and looked at him in the evening light. He looked very serious and very certain and very afraid all at once, and the combination of those things was the most honest thing she had ever seen. "Yes," she said, without qualification, without caveat, without any of the reasonable hesitation she had spent months curating. "Yes." The fear left his face, and what replaced it was something so open and unguarded that she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her with the same thoroughness he gave to everything, both arms and completely, and they stood there in the evening light with the grass smelling of rain around them and the first stars appearing in the east. "I'll need to tell Clara," she said against his shoulder. "What do you think she'll say?" Susanna thought about it. "She'll ask if she can have a horse of her own." Harvey laughed into her hair. "She can have a horse of her own." Clara's actual reaction, delivered the next morning over breakfast, was to look at Harvey with those serious dark eyes and say, "Does that mean you're my father now?" The table went very quiet. Rosaria stopped moving in the kitchen doorway. Harvey set down his coffee cup. "It means I would like to be," he said carefully, "if that's something you would want." Clara considered this with the solemnity of a judge reviewing evidence. "My papa died," she said. "I know," Harvey said. "You're not him." "No, I'm not." Another silence. Then Clara nodded once with the decisive air of someone who has reached a conclusion through proper process. "You can be my father too," she said, and picked up her biscuit and went back to eating, and Rosaria turned quickly back into the kitchen, and Susanna pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling, and Harvey looked at the table for a moment, and when he looked up his eyes were very bright. They were married in April. It was not a large affair because the nearest church was 20 miles away, and the circuit preacher was due through Abilene in the second week of April, and Harvey had written to arrange it. And on a Thursday, with the sky doing something extravagant in the south and the prairie grass just beginning to go green at the root, they stood before Reverend Thomas Hale and said their vows. The hands were cleaned up and present, Dutch with his hair combed and his hat in his hand, Felipe with wildflowers that he had picked and presented to Susanna with a red face and genuine feeling. Rosaria stood beside Susanna with the composure of a woman who had been expecting this outcome for months and was satisfied to have been right. Clara stood on Susanna's other side in her best dress with the yellow-haired doll tucked under her arm and watched the ceremony with the concentrated attention of someone who understands they are witnessing something important. Harvey's vows were plain and meant. He said, "I take you as my wife and my partner, and I will do right by you every day that I have." He said, "I have not been a man who was easy with people, and you have made that easier without my asking you to." He said, "I love you, Susanna Walker, with everything I have." Susanna's vows were equally plain. She said, "I came to your door expecting nothing and you gave me everything." She said, "I have been afraid for a long time and you have made me unafraid." She said, "I will be your wife and your partner and I will love you with everything I have, and what I have is more than I knew." When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Harvey cupped her face in both his big, careful hands and kissed her gently and fully, and Clara said loudly, "That's a long time," and everyone laughed and the afternoon light was golden, and the prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction, and it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the best days any of them had ever had. The summer that followed their marriage was the best summer Susanna could remember in her adult life. Not because it was without difficulty, because it wasn't. The cattle operation had its usual challenges. A dry stretch in July that required them to shift the south herd to better grass and move more water. A dispute with a drover passing through who claimed 2 of Harvey's steers, and had to be persuaded by the combined weight of Harvey's patience and Dutch's silence, and eventually follows Walker's pointed and specific knowledge of the cattle's brand markings. Clara got a small roan pony named Copper as promised and spent most of July falling off it and getting back on with a determination that made Harvey stand at the corral fence and grin in a way Susanna had not seen before. Pure, uncomplicated admiration for a small person's stubbornness. It was the best summer because of the specific quality of being home. That was the only word for what the ranch had become. And home is the kind of thing that you do not know you have been missing until you have it again. And then the recognition of it is so complete and so overwhelming that you sometimes have to stop in the middle of whatever you're doing and simply feel it. Susanna had felt it many times that summer. In the mornings when the kitchen was full of light and noise and Rosaria's voice and Clara's questions and Harvey coming in from the early morning work with his hat pushed back and his face open. In the evenings on the porch with Harvey's arm around her and Clara chasing fireflies in the yard below. In the account books, which were now an exact and satisfying record of a ranch that was doing better every month, the savings she had identified in the supply costs reinvested in a second water tank and a section of new fencing. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood in the yard of this house 4 months a widow with a carpet bag and $4.60, and a daughter who had stopped singing. She felt a complicated love for that woman, for her exhaustion and her determination, and the way she had lifted her chin and walked across the yard toward the unknown. That woman had done something brave, and it had paid off in a way that brave things sometimes do and sometimes don't, and the random mercy of that outcome was not something Susanna took for granted for a single day. In September, she told Harvey she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen early in the morning before anyone else was up, sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee between them and the blue dark of pre-dawn outside the windows. She had been certain for 2 weeks, and had spent those 2 weeks turning the knowledge over and examining it from every angle, looking for anxiety, and finding that mostly what she felt was an enormous and quiet joy that she hadn't been sure she was still capable of. Harvey went very still when she told him. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and said, "Susanna," and stopped. "I know," she said. "Are you well, perfectly well? Are you happy about it?" "Extremely happy about it," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her hands in his and then at her face and said, "I don't have words for how happy I am," which was so thoroughly unlike his usual economy of expression that it told her exactly how deep the feeling went. Rosaria received the news with the expression of someone who had already suspected it, and was pleased to have the confirmation, and said several things in Spanish that Susanna's growing but still limited Spanish couldn't fully follow, but whose emotional content was clearly warm. Clara, when told, asked 2 questions in rapid succession: whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and whether it would sleep in their room. When told they didn't know yet about the first question and know about the second, she processed this for a moment and said, "I would like a brother," which made Harvey laugh again, that full surprised laugh that Susanna loved. Dutch learned about it from Follows Water, who learned about it from Rosaria, which was the way information moved through the ranch, and Dutch appeared at the house door that evening with his hat in his hands, and offered his congratulations with a formality that was very Dutch, and then went back to the bunkhouse. And Susanna heard him telling the other hand something through the open window, and heard their voices raised in the kind of general approval that men express when they are pleased about something and not sure how to show it. Felipe showed it by bringing more wildflowers. Patrick showed it by being redder than usual for 3 days. Follows Water showed it by saying nothing directly and appearing 2 days later at the kitchen door with a small carved horse that he set on the window ledge without explanation and walked away. And when Susanna picked it up and looked at it, she found it had been carved from a single piece of wood with a skill that was almost beyond belief, every detail exact and elegant, and she set it on Clara's window ledge where it stayed. The fall roundup came and went with its usual chaos and exhaustion and satisfaction. Susanna rode the circuit with Harvey twice during the calmer parts of it, because she was not one to be confined to the house by her condition when she was feeling well, and Harvey rode close to her the whole time with a watchful protectiveness that she found more touching than annoying mostly. The cattle sold well in Abilene. The accounts were solid. The ranch was, by every measure she could apply to it, thriving. Winter came again, and this time Susanna was inside it rather than arriving on its edge. She knew the sound the wind made coming off the north, and the particular way the firelight looked different in December than in March, and the specific warmth of this house in cold weather. The stone walls holding the heat in a way that would never quite managed. She was larger by now and slower, and Clara had appointed herself a kind of unofficial caretaker with the serious devotion of a child who has found a purpose, appearing at Susanna's elbow at regular intervals to ask if she needed anything and to offer opinions on whether she was sitting comfortably enough. Harvey was different in the winter months than in the driving season, quieter in some ways and more present, with time to read in the evenings and to sit at the table and talk properly rather than in the brief exchanges that the working season allowed. Susanna discovered that he had strong opinions about the novels of Charles Dickens, which he had read as a young man in Ohio and returned to periodically, and that he could discuss the cattle trade with equal facility in terms of pure economics or in terms of the land itself and what it needed, and that he had a particular gift for explaining things clearly without condescension that had probably made him a good officer in the war, though he rarely talked about that. She told him, one January evening with the wind outside and the fire high and Clara asleep in Rosaria's lamp out, about her parents and about the aunt in Missouri, and about the years of being careful not to need too much. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and when she had finished he said, You were never actually asking for too much. You were asking for the right things from people who didn't have them to give. She thought about that for a long time after. The baby came in April, as the first green was coming into the grass. A boy, exactly as Clara had requested, 7 pounds and loudly indignant about the whole process of being born, which Rosaria attended with the expertise of a woman who had been present at a great many births and had opinions about all of them. Harvey waited in the main room, and Susanna could hear him walking, back and forth, the floor under his boots marking out the circuit of his anxiety. When Rosaria brought him to the door, he came in quietly and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and looked at the baby in her arms with an expression that she had no category for, not in all the expressions she had learned to read on his face, because it was new, a complete and unguarded wonder, as though this small red-faced person had exceeded all possible expectations simply by existing. "Hello," Harvey said to the baby, very quietly. The baby regarded him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born. "He's perfect," Harvey said, and looked at Susanna with that expression still on his face. "Are you all right?" "I'm very tired and very happy," she said. "Give him to Clara. She's been waiting all morning." Clara, who had been sitting on the bench in the hallway with her yellow-haired doll for the past 4 hours with a patience that was entirely out of character, was brought in and stood on the step stool that Rosaria produced and looked at the baby with her serious eyes. "What's his name?" she asked. Harvey and Susanna looked at each other. They had discussed names for weeks without deciding. "Thomas," Susanna said, and felt the rightness of it as she said it. "Thomas Harvey Underwood." Harvey's hand found hers on the quilt and held it. "Thomas," Clara repeated, testing the weight of it. She looked at Harvey. "That was my papa's name." "I know," Harvey said. "Do you mind it?" Clara thought about it with her usual judicial thoroughness and then shook her head once. "I like it," she said. "It means we don't forget him." She reached out and touched the baby's hand with one careful finger, and Thomas Harvey Underwood, who had been loudly indignant about everything so far, went very quiet and curled his tiny fingers around Clara's. The summer that Thomas was a baby was a different kind of full than the previous summer, full in the way that only a house with an infant in it can be, with a noise and an aliveness, and a particular sort of exhaustion that is not unpleasant even when it is relentless. Harvey learned to function on interrupted sleep with the same methodical determination he applied to everything, though he was grayer in the mornings for the first months, and Susanna had to physically stop him from getting up a third time in a single night, because she was not going to be the only one who slept. Clara took her role as older sister with passionate seriousness, supervising Thomas's waking hours with a vigilance that was both touching and occasionally suffocating, and Thomas rewarded this by smiling at her first, which Clara received as her absolute due and announced at dinner as though it were an important piece of legislation. Rosaria, whose hands were hurting more frequently now, allowed herself to be relieved of the heavy morning work with less resistance than before, accepting that she would train Susanna in the particular management of the kitchen and the household rather than running it alone, and this handover happened gradually and gracefully over the course of the year, so that by the following spring Rosaria was still present and still the authority on anything involving cumin or dried peppers or the proper way to press tortillas. But the main burden had shifted without Rosaria, needing to acknowledge that she was carrying less. Felipe had left in the fall, heading to Texas with a cattle outfit that had hired him on as a regular hand, and had ridden out with tears in his eyes and too many goodbyes, and the ranch had taken on a young man named Samuel who was 19 and from Alabama and learning the cattle trade from nothing, and Dutch was teaching him with the tremendous patience of a man who has nothing to prove and all the time in the world, and Follows Water was teaching him about horses in the way he taught anyone, by demonstration rather than instruction, and Samuel was learning. In the fall of that year, when Thomas was 6 months old and Clara had finally got the roan pony copper to stop shedding her at the canter, Susanna and Harvey had a Sunday evening of the kind that felt, in its completeness, like a summary of something. Clara was in the yard with Copper, walking the pony around the fence in the long sunset light, her small, upright figure and the horse's gentle movement, a thing of such uncomplicated beauty that it was difficult to look away. Thomas was asleep in the crib that Harvey had made himself from cedar wood over the course of 2 months, the work done in the evenings at the table while Susanna read or kept accounts, the plane and the chisel moving with a quiet determination. And the crib was not perfect in its proportions, but it was solid and fragrant and made entirely by hand with the attention of a person who was making it for someone he loved. Harvey had his arm around Susanna on the porch, and she had her head against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Light went long and amber, and the air was full of the smell of the dry grass and the cattle distant in the pasture and the first wood smoke of the season from the chimney. "I was thinking," Harvey said eventually, "about the north pasture, whether to put more fence in before winter." "You were not thinking about the north pasture," Susanna said. "No," he agreed. "I was thinking about you." A pause. "I was thinking about last April, you walking across my yard." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Were you?" "I was thinking about the door," he said. "That I was at the window and I saw you coming, and I had a moment of standing there before I moved." He was quiet for a second. "I almost waited for you to knock, and then I thought, no, open the door, and I did." "I was terrified," she said. "I had a whole speech prepared." "I know," he said. "I could see it in the way you were walking." She looked at him. "What did you see when you looked at me walking across the yard?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means he is finding the exact words. "I saw someone who had been through something hard and was still moving forward," he said. "Someone carrying something heavy and not letting it bend her." Another pause. "I saw someone I wanted to know." She felt the warmth of that move through her from her chest outward. "I saw someone who opened his door before I knocked," she said, "and I thought, this is either the most foolish or the most fortunate thing that has ever happened to me." "Which was it?" he asked. "Both," she said. "Very thoroughly both." He kissed the top of her head. Clara called from the yard, something about Copper and the fence, and they both looked, and Clara had gotten the pony to trot a small circle and was flushed with the success of it, shouting across the yard with the pure, unedited joy of a child who has gotten exactly what she wanted from a horse and cannot believe her own competence. "She's going to be extraordinary," Harvey said. "She already is," Susanna said. The years laid themselves down like grass after rain, one upon another, and the ranch grew with them. Harvey expanded the north herd in the spring of the year Thomas turned 2, bringing in a new bull from a breeding operation in Texas that required a 2-week trip during which Susanna ran the ranch with the same competence she brought to everything, and received Harvey's return with a relief she did not attempt to disguise. Thomas began to walk that same spring, making his determined and precarious way across the main room floor with the expression of a person who has decided that walking is a solved problem regardless of what his legs are doing, and Clara was his most fervent audience and most reliable catcher when he fell, which was frequent. Dutch rode into retirement, as he put it, to a small house in Abilene that a cousin of his owned, and left in the fall of Thomas's 2nd year with the same quiet lack of ceremony with which he had done everything, shaking Harvey's hand at the barn door and saying only, "Good place. You did all right with it," which from Dutch was the equivalent of a lengthy tribute. Harvey walked him to the road and watched him go and came back to the house with a look on his face that Susanna met with a cup of coffee and no words, because some things require the presence of someone who loves you and nothing more than that. Samuel proved himself over 3 seasons, and Harvey put him in charge of the North Range operations, which Samuel took on with the gravity of a man who understands he has been trusted with something. Follows Water stayed. He had always stayed, and Susanna suspected he always would, not out of obligation, but because the land and the horses and the particular daily work of the ranch were what he chose, and the ranch was one of the few places in Kansas in those years where that choice was respected without qualification. The injustice of the world that surrounded them could not be fully blocked out. In the spring of Thomas's third year, there was trouble to the south. Disputes between settlers and remaining Comanche groups that the newspapers in Abilene covered with a frank and cheerful bias toward the settlers that made Susanna put the paper down on the table one morning, with a precision that meant she was containing something larger than she wanted to say at breakfast. Harvey had read the same article and looked at her and said nothing, but his expression said the same thing hers did. Follows Water said nothing about any of it, because Follows Water rarely said things directly about the larger movements of the world. But there were evenings that fall when he sat on the fence of the corral in the blue dusk and looked south, and his stillness had a different quality to it. And Susanna left food for him sometimes on the fence post without comment, and he ate it without comment, and that was its own kind of conversation. Clara turned 9 in the summer and made a formal request at dinner to learn to shoot, citing as evidence the fact that Samuel had taught her to handle a lasso, and she had not dropped it on anyone, and that she could already ride better than Patrick, which Patrick disputed loudly, and that if she was going to be a rancher she needed to know everything. Harvey looked at Susanna across the table, and Susanna looked at Harvey, and they conducted a brief silent conversation of the kind that married people develop after a few years of practice. And Harvey said, "We'll start with a .22 rifle and proper instruction, and if you take it seriously you can continue, and if you don't, we stop." And Clara said, "Deal," with the decisiveness of someone who had been planning this negotiation for some time. Thomas, at 2.5, had formed the opinion that everything Clara did was interesting and proceeded accordingly, which meant that by the following spring he was also requesting a rifle, a request that was denied on grounds of age with the firm but tender consistency that Harvey applied to most things involving Thomas. And Thomas received the denial with the same loudly indignant response he had brought to the experience of being born, which was his particular form of self-expression, and which Susanna had come to understand would eventually moderate into something more refined. In the fall of the year Clara turned 10, Susanna discovered she was expecting again. She told Harvey in the same kitchen in the same early morning light, and his response was the same in its essentials, the stilled hands and the full attention and the simple happiness of a man who is exactly where he wants to be and knows it. "Clara will want a sister this time," Susanna said. "Probably," Harvey agreed. "Thomas will want another horse. He always wants another horse." "He comes by it honestly," Harvey said, and looked at her across the coffee cups with that amber-brown warmth in his eyes that she had first seen in a doorway 3.5 years ago, and that had never, not once, shown her anything but what was real. The second baby was a girl, born in the early summer, and they named her Margaret Rose, though she was called Maggie from the first hour, because Rosaria took one look at her and said, "She is a Maggie," with the authority of someone making a declaration of fact, and no one argued. Clara received the girl baby with a satisfaction that suggested she had arranged it herself, and Thomas looked at his new sister with an expression of cautious assessment that resolved, over the following weeks, into a proprietary affection that expressed itself primarily through standing very close to the crib and making faces. The ranch in those years was a living thing, a community of people bound together by work and by the particular loyalty that comes from hard seasons shared, and difficulty endured together and good evenings earned. Susanna thought about it sometimes in terms of what she had come from, the narrow bed in the boarding house, the worn boots, the $4.60, the carefully prepared speech she had never needed to give. She thought about the woman she had been at that door, and the woman she was now, and the distance between them felt like something that could be measured not in miles or years, but in depth, in the accumulation of belonging, in the solid particular weight of being known. Harvey found her one October evening in the last light, standing at the fence of the near pasture looking out across the grass, which was going gold and long in the late afternoon, the cattle moving through it at their slow habitual drift, and the sky above performing one of its extravagant Kansas sunsets, the color spreading from the western horizon in bands of orange and pink, and the particular deep rose that has no other name. He came and stood beside her and leaned on the fence and looked at what she was looking at. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, and this time when he asked it, it was not the beginning of something but the continuation, the ongoing question of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's inner life and have been for years. "I was thinking about gratitude," she said, "the particular kind that doesn't have anywhere to put itself." "Where does it go?" "Back into the thing you're grateful for, I suppose," she said. "Into the days, into this." She gestured at the pasture, and the sky, and the house behind them where Clara's voice could be heard, and the baby was making whatever noise Maggie made when she had opinions, which was often. Harvey put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the sky went deeper, the colors intensifying before they faded, and the grass moved in the evening wind, and the cattle went about their patient business, and the whole enormous Kansas sky put on its final performance of the day. "Harvey," she said. "Yes. I am so glad you opened the door." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice had that quality it sometimes had, careful and full and entirely sincere. "I am so glad you were on the other side of it," he said. The evening came down around them, and the stars appeared one by one in the east, and the lights went on in the house, and the smoke came from the chimney, and Clara called for supper in that carrying voice she had, which had never once been quiet since the day she found it again, and they turned from the fence and walked back toward the house together across the grass that was still warm from the day's sun, and the door stood open, and the light came from it in a long, warm rectangle across the dark yard, and they went in. The years continued to lay themselves down, each one building on the last, and the ranch continued to grow, and the children continued to grow, and the life that Susanna Walker had built from a carpet bag, and a name on a scrap of paper expanded and filled, and became the fullest thing she had ever known. Thomas grew from the loudly indignant baby into a serious and watchful boy, who had his mother's gift for numbers, and his father's gift for horses, and follows Water's particular ability to know what an animal needed before it knew itself, and who by the age of 7 was already being trusted with the smaller handling tasks around the ranch in a way that made Harvey stand back sometimes with his arms crossed and a look of pure pleased disbelief on his face. Maggie was entirely her own person from the start, with a stubbornness that exceeded even Clara's, and a laugh that filled rooms, and a conviction that all animals were fundamentally friends, who simply had not yet been properly introduced to her, which led to several memorable encounters with creatures that were less friendly than she expected, none of which injured her beyond the mild but taught her nothing about caution whatsoever. Clara grew toward 13 with the determined purposefulness she applied to everything, and in the winter of her 12th year, she told Harvey and Susanna at dinner that she wanted to go to the school in Abilene, the proper school, because the schooling she was getting from Susanna at the kitchen table was excellent, but she wanted to be around other students, and she had plans. Harvey and Susanna looked at each other across the table. The kitchen conversation this time was longer than usual. They arranged it the following fall, a boarding arrangement in Abilene with a respectable family that Susanna vetted personally with the thoroughness of a woman who had been a teacher, and knew what proper schooling looked like, and what inadequate schooling looked like. Clara went off with her trunk and her doll, which she still had, though she was too old to admit it, and came back at Christmas with higher arithmetic and 3 new friends, and the beginning of opinions about literature that she and Susanna could argue about happily for hours. Rosaria retired to Dodge City to live with her nephew's family in the spring of Susanna's 34th year, and they drove her to Abilene for the train in Harvey's wagon with the children and all of the food Rosaria had insisted on making for the journey, and Susanna held her hands on the platform and said, "You gave me this. You and your kitchen and your patience with a widow who didn't know what to do next." Rosaria shook her head. "You walked across the yard," she said. "That was yours." "You set an extra place for supper," Susanna said. Rosaria smiled, that warm, decisive smile. "I said it before I knew if you were coming," she admitted. "Mr. Harvey told me the evening before. He said if she comes, she'll be hungry and so will the little girl. So I set the places." She squeezed Susanna's hands. "He was already hoping for you before you arrived, Mrs. Underwood. Remember that." The train took Rosaria east, and they drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with Thomas standing in the back of the wagon between Harvey's knees, pretending to hold the reins, and Maggie asleep against Susanna's shoulder, and the prairie spreading out around them in its vast habitual indifference to human sentiment, which is not the same as coldness, just the particular freedom of a landscape that doesn't require you to be anything other than what you are. Harvey found a new cook eventually, a young woman from Wichita named Alice, who was competent and reliable and not Rosaria, which was not a criticism of Alice, but simply the fact that Rosaria had been unrepeatable, as some people are. Alice settled in, and the kitchen continued to function, and the house continued to be a house where people came and went and were fed. The years of the later 70s brought changes to the Kansas cattle trade, the railways pushing further south, and the trails from Texas shortening, and the price of beef going through its regular cycles of feast and lean. And Harvey navigated all of it with the steadiness that was the fundamental quality of his character, neither panicking in the lean times nor overreaching in the good ones, keeping the operation sound and the people in it paid and the land itself, which he talked about with the same long-term seriousness that he talked about everything, treated with the care of something you intend to leave in better condition than you found it. Susanna kept the accounts and ran the household and taught the children their letters and their figures and their history, and occasionally, when she thought about it, the history of the people who had lived on this land before any of them, before the fences and the cattle and the limestone houses, because those people existed, and their absence was not natural but made, and she thought her children should know that, and Harvey agreed with her. One autumn evening, when Thomas was 6 and Maggie was 3 and Clara was home from school for the harvest holiday, Harvey came into the kitchen where Susanna was working on the accounts with her reading glasses on and the lamp pulled close, and he sat down across from her and waited until she looked up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to look at you." She looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression she had developed for such statements, which contained several things at once, affection and mild exasperation, and a warmth that she didn't bother to conceal. "You can look at me after I finish the October figures," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and put his feet up on the empty chair and opened the Dickens novel he was currently rereading, and they sat together in the lamplight, while outside the Kansas fall moved in its enormous dark quiet, and inside the house the children slept and the fire crackled, and the accounts were finished and then set aside, and the Dickens was set aside, and they sat together the way they had learned to sit together over the years, in the particular ease of two people who have built something real and know it, and are not bored by the knowledge but daily and specifically glad of it. In the spring of that year, the circuit doctor came through and checked over everyone on the ranch as he did periodically, and pronounced Thomas healthy and growing, Maggie healthy and willful, and Susanna, with a professional calm that contained a smile, expecting a third child. Harvey received this information standing in the yard beside the doctor's wagon, and was quiet for a moment, and then shook the doctor's hand with more force than was strictly necessary, and said thank you 3 times. The baby was another boy, born in October with the harvest moon large over the plains, and they named him James, and he was from the beginning a quiet and contented soul, who seemed to have arrived already at peace with the world, which was as different from Thomas's first opinion of existence as could be imagined, and which made Susanna laugh when she thought about it. James slept and ate and regarded the family with his large dark eyes, and was perfectly satisfied with everything, which Susanna considered a gift after Maggie's first year of passionate and comprehensive opinions about all subjects. The ranch had found its full size by the time Susanna was 36. It was large enough to be a serious operation and small enough to be fully known, the way you can know a place, every fence and water source and patch of shade and particular piece of ground that floods in spring. Harvey knew it that way and Susanna had learned it that way and the children were learning it, each in their own fashion. There was an evening that Susanna returned to many times in memory, though it happened only once. It was a May evening, the spring that James was walking and Thomas was 7 and Maggie was 4, and Clara was home from Abilene for the summer. And Harvey had come in from the late work and they had all eaten together, the whole family at the table, loud and various and specific. And after supper, Clara had gotten out the guitar she had started learning in Abilene and was picking out a tune with the careful imprecision of the newly learning. And Thomas was trying to teach Maggie a card game with more rules than Maggie was willing to follow. And James was sitting in Harvey's lap, examining a carved horse, with the focused wonder of a baby who has discovered what a thing is made of. And Susanna was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dishcloth and a coffee cup, and looking at all of it. Harvey looked across the room and found her in the doorway, and they looked at each other for a moment. Just a moment, across the comfortable chaos of their family. And what passed between them in that look was everything, all of it, every day from the day she walked across the yard to this evening with the guitar and the card game and the baby in his lap and the Kansas dark outside the windows. And he smiled at her, the full particular smile that was for her. And she smiled back and felt the familiar warmth of it in her chest like a coal that never quite went out, and thought, as she had thought many times and would think many more, that the best thing she had ever done was walk across that yard and not knock and trust that the man on the other side of the door was worth the risk. He had been worth it. He had been more than worth it. He had been the door opening before she could ask, the place set at the table before she arrived, the hand offered across the account books, the name said in a particular way for the first time, the vows at sunset, the cedar crib, the hand in hers at the fence in every season, the long habit of two people choosing each other daily with the full knowledge of what they are choosing and why, which is the truest and most durable form of love that exists. Outside the window, the May dark was warm and full of the smell of the grass coming in on the wind, and the children made their noise, and Harvey bounced James gently on his knee and James laughed, and Clara found the tune she had been looking for and played it through once, clear and complete, and Thomas threw his cards in the air and Maggie shrieked with delight, and Susanna Walker Underwood stood in the doorway of her home and thought, "This is everything," and it was. The years after that were the settled years, the years of daily life lived fully in its own right, with the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life that has found its proper shape. There were difficult seasons and easy ones. There were winters that came hard and springs that came late and a summer when the cattle prices fell so low that Harvey spent 3 evenings at the table with the account books, and the kind of silence that Susanna recognized as serious calculation. And she sat with him, and they worked through it together and found the path through, which was narrow but solid. There was the year Clara finished her schooling in Abilene and came home for good, 19 years old with her dark hair pinned up in her serious eyes, and a precision of thought that her mother recognized and her father respected. And she rode out with Harvey the first morning, and came back at noon with mud on her boots and sun on her face, and the expression of someone who has come home to exactly the right place. She was not the same small girl who had been carried to the wagon by her father's murderous grief 4 months a widow's daughter, and yet she was, the way people remain themselves through all the accumulation of experience, the essential character present from the beginning and everything else layered over it. Thomas at 10 was the natural heir to the ranch in every practical sense, though neither Harvey nor Susanna said so, because it was simply apparent in the way he moved through the work of the place. He had Follows Water's gift with horses and his mother's head for numbers and his father's patience with things that took time, and the ranch would be in sound hands when the time for that came, though that time was far off still. Maggie at 7 was Maggie, a force of nature in small boots, and the animals of the ranch had long since accepted their role as her friends, and submitted to her various theories about them with the resignation of those who have tried resistance and found it insufficient. James was 5 and content, still the most peaceable member of the family, and Harvey sometimes looked at him with an expression of gentle puzzlement at how a family containing Susanna and Clara and Maggie had produced a child this serene. But James seemed entirely satisfied with his position in the world and showed no inclination to revise it. Follows Water left the following spring, not suddenly, but in the way that things have been coming for a long time and arrive without surprise. He told Harvey at the barn one morning that he was going south, that there was a community of his people near the Red River that he intended to join. He said it simply, and Harvey received it simply, and they stood together for a moment in the barn door with the early light coming in and the horses shifting, and Harvey said, "You have been essential to this place." And Follows Water said, "The place will be fine." And they shook hands, and Follows Water took the gray horse Harvey offered him and rode south into the morning, and everyone watched him go in their own way. Susanna stood at the fence and watched the figure diminish to a point and disappear into the long grass, and thought about the conversation she had once had with Thomas, her first husband, about the land and who had been on it before them, and felt the weight of that again, the particular sorrow of the country's history that lived in every piece of ground and could not be fully made right, but also could not be honestly ignored. The spring that James turned 6 was the spring that a letter arrived from Gerald Potts. Susanna opened it at the table and read it twice and then set it down and looked at it. Harvey came in from outside and saw her face and said, "What?" "Gerald Potts has died," she said. "He left me a small bequest. His letter says he felt guilty about the way things went with Thomas's estate, that he could have done more." She paused. "He left me $300. Harvey sat down. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it honestly. "I feel like he was a man who did less than he could have when it mattered and tried to make it right when he couldn't," she said. "I feel that is not uncommon." She folded the letter. "I'm going to use it to set up the school fund." The school fund was an idea she had been developing for 2 years, a fund to pay for proper schooling for children on the surrounding ranches whose families couldn't afford it, because there were several such families in the area and the children went untaught, and it was, in Susanna's thorough opinion, an entirely solvable problem. Harvey looked at her with that expression she knew as his admiration face, the one he didn't always know he was wearing. "Of course you are," he said. The school fund worked. By the following winter, it was supporting 4 children schooling in Abilene, and the year after that it was 7. And Susanna managed it with the same organized precision she applied to the ranch accounts, and Harvey contributed to it from the operation's profits each year as a matter of course. And Clara, who had inherited both her mother's teaching instinct and her mother's organizational abilities, took over the administration of it when she turned 21, with a competence that made Susanna feel the specific pride of watching your child become better at something than you were. The full weight and beauty of the life that Susanna Walker had built came to her most completely in the quiet moments rather than the large ones, though the large ones were good. It came to her on a January morning when the snow was deep and the ranch was white and still, and she was standing at the kitchen window with a coffee cup, and Harvey came up behind her and wrapped both arms around her and rested his chin on her head, and they stood together in the kitchen silence looking at the white world outside, and he said, so quietly it was almost not said, "Look at this." She knew he didn't mean the snow. "I know," she said. She knew that the woman who had walked across that yard with her carpet bag and her daughter and her prepared speech had not been able to imagine this, had not had the capacity to imagine it, because you cannot imagine a fullness you have never had. You can only walk toward the closed door and hope. And the door had opened. It had opened before she knocked because the man behind it had been watching from the window and had decided, in the way that good men sometimes make good decisions in the small moments that matter enormously, to move toward the person coming rather than wait for them to come to him. That was the whole story, in one way. A woman walking across a yard and a man opening a door, and everything after it, the long, beautiful consequence of those two small acts of courage, hers and his together, the choice to come and the choice to receive, which are after all the essential movements of every love story that has ever been told, stripped to their bones. She had been a widow arriving at a ranch with nothing but her own determination, and he had been a man alone in a limestone house with more room in it than he had been filling. And then they had been neither of those things anymore, and the house had filled, and the years had filled, and the life had been made, real and lasting and entirely their own. Harvey's hand found hers on the coffee cup and held it, and outside the snow lay perfect and undisturbed over the ranch and the grassland beyond it. And in the other rooms the children were beginning to stir. James first with his quiet contentment, and then Maggie with her loud opinions, and then the various sounds of a household waking into its day, and Thomas's boots on the floor heading for the barn, because Thomas was always first to the barn. And somewhere in all of that the ordinary, extraordinary morning of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Susanna turned in Harvey's arms and kissed him just once, warm and simple, and he kissed her back. And she said, "Good morning," and he said, "Good morning," and the day began.